What's good, everybody? Welcome back to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today we have a dope ass video. We have a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, some famous experiments in psychology. We're going to be talking about some passages from Blood Meridian, as well as the Iliad. So the overarching theme, all of this, the thread kind of running through them all, has something to do, I think, with, I guess, the overall theme of war, whether it be at the individual scale, at the level of institutions, between countries, nations, what have you. This idea of war, inhumanity upon other people, the nature of power. We're going to be talking about all of that. And like I just kind of mentioned, what really kind of got me thinking about this was what's currently going on with Israel and Palestine. And it's just fascinating to me, almost like in a larger psychological sense, how, of course, obviously starting from the Holocaust, Jewish people were horribly persecuted in what has to be one of the most egregious moral stains in human history in the Holocaust, during which 6 million Jewish people were ethnically exterminated by the German government. And of course, no one really needs a refresher on this. We all learned in history class some of the insane atrocities where just millions of people were rounded up, they were starved, they were forced in these concentration camps, had to do extreme brutal labor, oftentimes just literally tortured. Like, I remember hearing about those experiments where, like, how many times does it take for a person to get hit in the hammer with a head to find out that they died? Like these insane, horrific experiments, just the worst of the worst that was done unto the Jewish population under the Third Reich. And what's fascinating to me, even just at the psychological level, is how at these same group of people who should be most attuned, like, it was either their parents or their grandparents who actually literally lived through the Holocaust. It's these same people who are turning around and doing the same thing unto the Palestinian people. And of course, here I'm just talking about like the Israeli Zionists, which are, of course, not all Jewish people are Zionists, but as I understand it, Zionism is a ethno-religious kind of apartheid power which is trying to essentially expunge the Palestinian people from their homeland, and they're doing it in the same genocidal fashion that they themselves just a couple generations were on the receiving end of. Like, when you hear about how they are bombing schools, they are bombing hospitals, I mean, you can just look at the Gaza Strip, the whole place, residential, civilians, everything has just been completely flattened. And you have, countless at this point reports coming from journalists and Doctors Without Borders who are reporting that they are treating children, right? Like literal children, or like, 10, 11, 12-year-olds who have sniper bullets straight in the heart, straight in the brain.
You're saying that children in Gaza are being shot by snipers?
Definitively. I have two children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately, and directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best sniper. And they're dead center shots.
Of the people who worked in the right setting, the emergency room, a neurosurgeon, a trauma surgeon like me, an anesthesiologist, critical care doctor, that kind of thing, I think it was 84% regularly saw children shot in the head or chest. But when a small child is being shot in the head or the chest throughout the Gaza Strip on a regular or daily basis in the catchment area of every hospital where there's an international presence, that you're getting into like ridiculous territory when you claim that this is an accident.
Like, these are people who are knowingly sniping children, and at this point now they've completely cut off all humanitarian aid, so there's no food that's allowed to get in, so all the Palestinians are starving. And I'm sure anyone, even if you're like totally not in tune with this at all, which I can't even say like I'm particularly informed, but anyone has seen these horrific videos of just starving Palestinian children, children with their limbs blowing off, mothers picking up the limbs of children. And when I say this kind of stuff, like, it literally sounds like it could have been taken out of a page of the history book of the same treatment that Jewish people received during the Holocaust. And all of this kind of just got me thinking about actually a phenomenon that takes place in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who is, of course, a Jewish person who famously went into the Auschwitz camp and wrote this whole, beautiful memoir, which we've talked about on the channel. But he talks about like a group of prisoners who are essentially, they're called capos, and they're Jewish people, but they kind of function as like the Nazi underlings and are essentially almost kind of like the enforcers of like the Nazi officer agenda. And he says that these, Jewish prisoners, they're afforded special privileges and everything like that. But what he noticed was they were oftentimes more brutal to their own Jewish brethren than the actual Nazi officers were. And this kind of led me to my next train of thought, which reminded me of a famous set of experiments I learned in my psychology degree called the Stanford Prison Experiments. And basically what this is by Philip Zimbardo. And it's a infamous, I'll say actually, because there's a lot of controversy surrounding it. it, but experiment where they basically recruited college participants. They were tested to make sure they were psychologically stable, didn't have any mental health conditions, no, physical health conditions, just, run-of-the-mill, normal people. And what happened was they made up like this makeshift kind of prison. I think it was in the basement of the psychology department in Stanford. I'm not sure the specifics, but they made a makeshift prison, and they assigned half the people totally randomly to be prisoners and half the people to be guards. And they essentially just kind of let them loose, and that was the experiment. And what happened was, after a few days, the guards became increasingly abusive to the prisoners, where they're hurling like, verbal abuse, oftentimes making them kind of do like, physical punishment. I think at some point they were told to like strip their clothes, and it just became increasingly more brutal behavior towards the prisoners. And they started, the prisoners themselves, started freaking out. They would break down in tears. After a few days, one of them had to get sent home because it was so psychologically damaging him. And after the experiment was supposed to go for 2 weeks, but after a week, the behavior on both sides here, just the actual seemingly like, mental and physical abuse that the prisoners were undergoing versus like, the abusive, brutalizing behavior by the prisoner guards. Because of all this, after a week, they called the whole experiment off, and it has lived in infamy ever since. And obviously there are a ton of implications that come from this. Like, one is just like, is it the structural nature of just having some kind of power dynamic, like, one group of people having power over another group of people? And there's so many implications too for like, something like the prison and justice system. But really the thing that came to mind for me is something that Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning poses directly for the reader. And he's basically like, you cannot judge these people, all the people in Germany who participated in the Holocaust and the extermination of Jews. You cannot judge them until you have asked yourself in all honesty, if you are born and raised in this society, and if you were just fed this constant stream of propaganda, and if your livelihood and the safety of you and your family, if it depended on that, right? And playing ball and participating in this, and definitely not, actively standing out, you have to ask yourself in all honesty before you judge these people, whether if you were in their shoes, you would not have done the same. And of course, genocide is nothing new. The foundation of the United States, of course, was landing on North America and just exterminating to the tune probably rivaled only by the Holocaust, just a massive bloody extermination of all the native peoples on this land. And of course, genocide is just something that's been found all throughout in all civilizations throughout history. And this kind of led my mind towards a great passage in Blood Meridian from the famous character, the judge. And so I just wanted to read this because I think it's a very good diagnosis of sort of human nature and the human condition. "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way." So it's this idea that, war is, I think, a fundamental intrinsic principle of human nature. Now, normally I've kind of been on the more optimistic side. Like, this is something ultimately we can learn from. With education and learning the lessons of history, this is something that ultimately we can outgrow. But more and more lately, I've been leaning more towards the judge's philosophy that, war endures. And all of this is seconded by, I think, a really powerful epigraph of course, Blood Meridian, which comes from basically researchers from UC Berkeley. And they found that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier showed evidence of having been scalped. In other words, since the dawn of humanity, there has been war. We are seeing evidence 300,000 years old of people scalping one another. And again, you just very reminiscent of the judge quote, right? Before man was, war waited for him. This is something that goes back 300,000 years. And something else that's related here, what comes to mind for me is the Iliad, one of the oldest books in all of, recorded written history. It's almost 3,000 years old. And what is this book about? It's got Achilles and Patroclus, it's got the gods, it's got the mythology, but by and large, I think the primary theme of this book is war. That is what this entire book is about. It's the backdrop, it's the central theme, And so what does it mean that one of the very first books that ever showed up in the beginning of, recorded written history, what does it mean that it has to do with war? And, like I said earlier, I used to think war is something we could kind of outgrow, but at this point, it's been almost 3 millennia, since the Iliad, let alone before that. how many, you know, hundreds and hundreds of iterations of this have we gone through? And still, you know, what do we see? Now, not only do we have something like Israel-Palestine, where there is still a genocide actively going on, and because of social media, it's just being broadcast before everyone's eyes. Not only is it still taking place, but a country like the USA is actively funding it and allowing it to happen. So, you know, what has history taught us? Apparently nothing. You know, 3,000 years of history, and we are still doing the same thing that essentially was taking place in the Iliad. We are still effectively scalping each other like they were 300,000 years ago. So this was just some random thoughts, maybe a little pessimistic, but I wanted to bring in literature, psychology, some history, and just make a video talking about some of my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think, and in the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching the Big Nate Review.